Hi everyone, thank you very much for tuning in and welcome to this Fireside session about women in marketing. Just to introduce myself, I work for Ben as Senior Client Director EMEA. In brief, Ben is an entertainment artificial intelligence company that integrates brands into influencer streaming, TV, music and film content. I'm thrilled to be joined by Liz Caselli-Mechae, who's Head of Content and Digital at Nestle Master Brands globally. Liz and her team work to produce compelling digital content and ensure industry-leading social media communications driven by audience insights on purpose-based stories around climate, sustainability, innovation and inclusion. Prior to Liz's global role, she led Nestle digital content in the US and received recognition for the Best Content Marketing Program of 2020 by the Rally Awards. She also worked with nonprofit organizations and is a proud board chairman for Miriam's Kitchen, working to end chronic homelessness in Washington, DC. Liz, welcome. It's a great opportunity to speak to you today. Thank you very much for joining the conversation around women in marketing. You're joining us from Switzerland today, and you recently moved from the US during the pandemic. This can't have been easy. How was your move?
Yep, easy is not the word I would use, but I will say I had great support all the way along, and so it was probably as easy as it could have been. I think that it's been an adventure. I think one of the things that has surprised me is a lot of the things I was nervous about actually went very smoothly, whereas some things I took for granted have really challenged me. So a lot of my focus has been on working in a more cross-cultural environment, being on teams that are truly global in nature, and figuring out what that means for communication styles and leadership styles and the right incentives and how you kind of create a comfortable and psychologically safe environment for the team. So it's been a lot to digest in a short amount of time, but definitely a fast rate of learning, which is exciting in itself.
Great. I love Switzerland. I'm very jealous. I'm going
and there've
to
been a lot of beautiful hikes with the dog as well.
Absolutely. I'm going to go straight into the leadership questions, actually. And as a leader yourself, you're always developing your abilities. So we wanted to ask you, what are you looking to improve on in the back half of 2021?
Yeah, I think especially not having an inherent cultural similarity with everyone on my team. I think what I would like to continue to get much stronger at is really customizing my approach for an individual or for a setting. Whereas there are some things that we had as a team, team motivation and things like that in the US that were very grounded on cultural similarity. I think a huge focus for me now is how do I find the right path for the right person, both with the culture they're coming from and also just their culture as an individual and how they fall on some of those cultural indices. I'm a big nerd about the self-assessment kind of material, but being able to really change approach and read those feedback signals to continue to customize your approach to make it effective for the person and not just for you from your own perspective.
That sounds great. And I know that obviously diversity, sustainability, innovation are kind of big passion points for you. What skills would you like your marketing team to develop based on those kind of changes that you want to make?
That's a great one. I have a long wish list for all of us. We have a very kind of continuous improvement mindset, and we're a team that likes to be very hands-on and do sort of direct development, even if that's not how we're doing our main campaign, so that we're getting cross experience. But I think the biggest thing would really be just being incredibly audience attuned, really being audience centric, having that be the focus in all spaces, in all conversations, and calibrating more and more to take the audience feedback loops and really apply those insights to every next project to get smarter and smarter about our audience.
And that must be hard because you work across all brands. So that's a lot of insights and data that you have to analyze, right, to do that.
It's a lot of audience segments. I would say one of the things that we're having to continuously reinforce is that learning something once doesn't mean it's a learning that applies everywhere. So if we learn something about socially conscious millennials in the UK, you really can't assume that's going to be the exact same application when we're looking at that. I mean, parents in West Africa, like it's a really wide range of the segments that come up. So it is it's a lot of having to build, but also compartmentalize.
Yeah, we spoke before, didn't we, about some of the sort of changes that have come through the pandemic as well, and millennials and Gen Z being very focused on transparency and sort of relating and aligning with companies that share their same kind of brand values. So it'd be really interesting to know sort of what changed through the pandemic, especially across the business you look after, and how you're kind of adapting to that with the industry and internally actually as well.
Yeah, I think transparency, authenticity are big watchwords. It wasn't totally new territory in the face of the pandemic, but it was something that became much more primary. And I would say a lot of content, even that we produced directly, got really scrubbed down for logistical reasons when we first went away from studio production, went away from full crews. And that was a really interesting transition to say, if we can all agree that production value doesn't matter, what does? And how does that authenticity kind of intersect with some of your content choices and making content choices that are really going to be the best for the audience and going to be the best for kind of the space that you're meeting them in.
That's great. And you were talking as well about sort of how you implement that with teams, because you've worked for some smaller non-profit organizations as well as obviously now a huge company like Nestle, and just how you kind of work with those teams internally to sort of adapt and make change, and how do you kind of start that within your team and then kind of cascade that across the business?
Yeah, I think there is and probably always will be a lot of kind of education, and digital can play a really important role in setting that audience first mindset and stimulating that conversation. So certainly in the past 6 months, one thing I've been doing a lot of is internal roadshows and really coming into spaces and talking about who is your audience, understand that, what does that mean for your digital strategy, what's in your digital toolbox, kind of how can you think about pulling different levers in different situations with your audience and calibrating appropriately for what they need and where they are. And I love it. There are certain things, I know that there are certain insights that if I put up on the screen, it's going to derail us in a good way, and everyone's going to be like, whoa, like this, in that case, should we look at this? Have we tested it this way? Like, and so I'm a huge fan of that kind of environment, really being education first, also being receptive to that. I mean, I'm a big believer that like digital is one of the teams that needs to carry that flag throughout the organization and be bringing outside in. But also that's something we really welcome from our climate specialists and from lots of subject matter experts that go outside what we can possibly bring, and being just as open to hearing from them and understanding what they see on the landscape, and really being symbiotic in that way.
Have you sort of come against any challenges that have made that more difficult, and sort of how have you overcome them? Or would you say it's an ongoing challenge because you're trying to change perception?
It is. I think sometimes if I'm in a complaining mood, I will say I can't, in 2021, almost 2022, we really shouldn't be talking about if digital has a seat at the table. That's like a very 2009 conversation for me. We should be way, way past that strategically in the role that digital plays. But the reality is it depends a lot on the part of the conversation, the part of the organization, and what they're focused on and the ways that they execute, and if that's changed and hasn't changed. So I would say it's there are definitely challenges in making sure that some of that digital literacy stuff is front of mind, that the right people are in the room from the beginning of projects rather than kind of coming at the end and seeing digital as a last like layer to put on a marketing or communications effort. And so that absolutely can be challenging. It's happening not just with my team, but with lots of teams in the organization are doing a great job carrying the trumpet there. So it's something that I think we're making great progress on, but it's work that's never done. And even when we've kind of gotten that to that 2021 mindset we want on designing for digital first and being data informed, the environment will continue to evolve. Our peers will continue to push boundaries, and we'll be doing the roadshow all over again. So I'm sure it will be never ending.
That's great. So with that in mind, sort of what channels will really matter or sort of be important to Nestle's growth over the next few years? I know you lost work with work a lot with social. We spoke a bit about ambassadors as well, or aligning with some influencers. But sort of which channels are sort of most important to you moving that business forward?
Yeah, I think day to day, we take a very channel centric strategy. When we look out years, we try to kind of break out of the channel construct and think about where our audience is going. I think ambassadors is something that we see being really channel agnostic. We think about ambassadors kind of like at their cocktail party as much as in their feed, and how we're sort of cultivating and equipping our ambassadors to engage really sincerely with the brand and bring a lot of passion, and how do we create experiences for them where that enthusiasm will carry through, no matter what channel they're executing on, so that when a new platform kind of catches fire, it's less about well, it will be about learning the intricacies of that platform and how you really perform well there, but that we're building on a foundation that's much more about kind of our core identity that should be able to translate anywhere, and being able to have ambassadors that can be in all spaces because they're coming with that sincere passion and experience. And when you're in food and beverage, that's luckily like creating amazing experiences comes like very naturally to the product and the brands. So I think that that's something that we've tried to kind of change mindset when we look out farther, to not necessarily have a sense of what will be the next hot thing and trying to place bets there, but rather having a really strong sense of what we have to say and who our audience is, and then the platforms and channels will come.
That's great. And with your transition from the US market to now the global markets, what sort of like how has that been for you, for anyone that's looking to make that move themselves in the industry? What have you got any tips on how to make that transition?
Yeah, it's incredibly exciting. It's very enriching. I think that pace of learning is super fast, and you feel a sort of, you're using muscles you haven't used in a long time. There are some ways that it almost has me like flashing back to when I was first starting my career, and I would like, you know, be texting my friends and saying like, what do you do if there's this kind of vibe, or how do you ask this kind of question? It honestly feels like in many ways like being a freshman again to go into such a new culture, but in a way that has you has you firing on all cylinders. So it takes a lot of flexibility and open-mindedness, but I would say most of all, patience with yourself, because certainly my first 6 months in a new country, still working in my native language in this case, but operating day to day not in my native language, you're not bringing your absolute best to your work. It's just not a realistic expectation of yourself, and so it helps to kind of take a step back, have advocates. So my boss at Nestle very much sets that long game expectation that you're not going to solve it all overnight. Know what your long game is, and knowing you can give yourself some time, that you're not going to need to be perfect day one, and that's not a realistic expectation of yourself, because if you don't start to relax that, you'll really make yourself crazy, which I did for several months.
That's really great advice. And I think when we talk about diversity, a lot of that can be just down to sort of culture as well. So we assume that just because, even if we sort of speak the same language, that things are very similar, but we know they're not. We've all worked at different companies and in very different ways. And I think, you know, if we look at it, actually, what's quite interesting for I think some of the people watching is to perhaps think about how they can make those changes, but also to maybe some of the younger people who have tuned in, just learning about how they can really grow in an organization, and maybe, you know, bring some of their own kind of diverse cultural views to the forefront in discussions, and how easy it is to be able to do that. And I wondered if you'd experienced any of that at Nestle.
Yeah, I think that's a factor all the time. And in the US, I got to be part of a really interesting transition, which was a full headquarters move for Nestle, which meant that we were bringing in a lot more talent in a new city. And it was a real kind of influx of energy and different perspectives. I would say my best advice at kind of like bringing that as you grow in an organization, is really look for places to add value and start from that mindset of adding value even there are times to set boundaries, but like as a fundamental, like even outside your scope, come into those conversations with your core orientation being, are there little ways I can bring my perspective, my expertise, and bring value to this other initiative? I often find that the work that I look back and I'm like, man, that was so strategically important and critical for our objectives, that is valued by some people, but a lot of what like I'm really remembered for and created some of my strongest relationships and sponsorships within the organization was stuff that at the time I was like, well, this isn't really our main priority, but I think we can like really deliver some value here. Let's make sure we're in. And it's really important to someone and to someone who continues to be a relationship and in many cases, mentors for me. So having that orientation towards openness and that seeking to create value, never compromising on what you know is the most strategically important, but allowing some of those extracurriculars to come in because it can be an unusual path towards some of your more important relationships.
That's fantastic advice, and something we probably will need to be very aware of still as we try and adapt and evolve in our businesses. I'd like to dive into your experience as a female leader in marketing today. I wondered if there have been any significant barriers in your career today to any of the organizations that you've worked at previously or currently, but anything that's kind of been a barrier to you?
Yeah, I would say the one reason that I ended up at Nestle is that I started in an industry that really prioritized seniority on straight tenure. And so there was really limited opportunities to accelerate. You kind of grew as you got the years under your belt. And I found that to be a really frustrating environment for me. And I was sort of conflicted about it. I really liked the work and I thought, well, I'll take a few years in a different industry, get a different kind of experience and come back. And then I realized when I moved into Nestle world, it was personally, it was just a better match for what I found motivating and engaging. And so that was something that also when you're in a space that prioritizes tenure, your leadership is also fundamentally inheriting the diversity issues of decades ago. So it's also an environment that won't progress quickly from a diversity and inclusion perspective. But going to somewhere that's very results focused, faster moving, I think was a really positive move for me. Now, at every organization I've been in, especially in communications, there's still a factor of your chemistry with leaders, being a consigliere, as you might say, and really like having a lot of that relationship with leaders being a big part of things. And there will be, and there always will be leaders who their go-to guy is going to be their go-to guy. And that you can kind of see like, okay, you're never going to be their right hand on something. What's the role you can fill? What's the expertise you can bring? For me, in those environments, that has a timestamp. There's only so long you want to look at roles that aren't really going to be accessible to you, and that truly organization agnostic. I've seen leaders like that in any industry, in any company, but then you find your leaders who either you have more of that kind of shared common viewpoint, you can click in and give them strong counsel, or they're really truly more oriented towards seeking someone who's bringing a different perspective, and they prefer that natural kind of spar in their direct kind of counsel and relationships. So there definitely have been times that I've had to move away from places that I felt like I would hit a ceiling, but there was always kind of the next room to step into, and a leader with whom I felt I could be more valued and have a higher ceiling.
It definitely feels like the industry's moved on a lot. And years ago, it used to be one rule sort of fits all, but now we realize there are so many other nuances within the way people work and what we expect from them. And I think from a lot of the companies that we speak to, people are making smaller changes internally and externally that will make a huge difference in the end. I wondered if you'd been confronted with any kind of gender-related roadblocks in your career to date.
Yeah, I think that because of that sort of cultural similarity point and the mindset, there are places that you might not have the same openness in a conversation that someone is going to have with someone who's exactly like them. If you have a white male leader, they may not be all the way settled, all the way open until they're only surrounded by people who are like them. I mean, I think that's a minority. but it's definitely an environment that you can see. I think that you can sort of feel the difference after that experience of stepping into a room that doesn't function that way, that gets to real kind of candor and directness and wrestling with issues openly, and sort of like I know the previous panelists were talking about kind of team of rivals, like letting ideas fight it out. And so you feel the difference going into that sort of dynamic environment. And that's, I think, where I really turn on and start to thrive as an individual as well. I bring a better self to those spaces. And so when I'm finding environments that feel a little closed, or that they're not surfacing, the real challenges, or they're not engaging in it totally sincerely, you feel the change when you can come into other environments. And usually it goes both ways, like that. When you light up more in that environment, that's also what kind of has enabled my growth. When I come into an environment that I find dynamic and energizing, those are also the places that I can really accelerate.
That's fantastic. And something that's really important, actually, I think, to all of us women in our industries is the question on how we should support other women in their organizations. Because it's kind of, I guess, easy to think about yourself when you're trying to, overcome some of those issues, those roadblockers, those maybe gender-related issues. But in terms of supporting other women inside the organizations, what sort of advice do you have around that, or things that have worked maybe, or views that you have around that?
Yeah, I think there are three things that really stand out to me when I think about that. One is coming with a lot of candor, including in feedback, being willing to give feedback that's growth oriented, not feeling like you should be sugarcoating it. Kind of, because it takes courage to give. It takes courage to take feedback, and it takes courage to give feedback. And I think both women and men who are rising talents are disserved by not being given genuine feedback. So one, I would say, is to support upcoming talent, and maybe especially young women, is to really give candid feedback and to orient towards growth. The second would be to make it safe for them to give feedback and to flag issues, because I think that in particular, I can say, and I think there's some gender in my lens that makes me afraid of being a complainer. That's something that, particularly as a woman in the workplace, that I really don't want to be seen as complaining or dissatisfied. But I think you can really do rising talent, and particularly do women, a service by saying, like, it's okay, let's surface the things that are frustrating, let's attack them. It's not all going to get solved, like you're not going to leave it, but let's talk about it, and we can take a productive mindset to that, and it doesn't make you a complainer, and you don't need to pretend everything's fine until the day you like really lose it and walk out the door. Like, don't do that. Let's surface
when it's too late,
when it's still solvable. And there is a lot of fear, I think, of being a complainer. And then lastly, I would say and that this sometimes is the hardest in practice, because we work in such fast-paced environment that's urgent. You can't take extra time with things, but be willing to give projects that you are going to need to rework together. Yeah. Be willing to give a rising talent a project that's outside their comfort zone, that they will not do well the first time, that you are going to have to work hands-on together. And I think that's one that I would say is something I've particularly focused on for women who maybe sit in other parts of the business and don't necessarily get growth or get recognition where they are, and are looking at where they can go next. I am a lover of the creating a stretch project, of creating something to get somebody outside their day to day. But you really do have to approach it with a mindset that's like, this isn't going to be done as well or as quickly as you gave it to someone who already knew how to do it. What would the point of that be? So it's you have to approach with some patience, and I think that can often be the first thing that goes out the door when you're stretched on a project or a campaign. But it's one that I think is so valuable, and is particularly for anyone who's stuck in one place, is a really helpful avenue to help them keep growing and find other paths that break out of the role that they're in.
That's a really great point, because I think we put pressure on ourselves to be very good at things straight away. And then you start to get imposter syndrome, where you're sort of sizing yourself up against someone that's perhaps been doing it for longer, or has, more experience in that particular skill set. And so you're right, it sort of pays to maybe encourage a bit of failure, not being great at something straight away, but challenging yourself, and being able to be a bit more flexible and open about the things you're good at and not so great at. So that's really good advice.
And I would say, from your earlier question on kind of like things to work on as a leader, this is a big one for me, because the other thing that I have had to be very intentional about is, when that first version of the project comes back, be willing to say, to flat, like, give narrative direction and say, take another shot, and here are some things to look for, and see this example, as opposed to being like, okay, now watch me redo it and see what I do. So that to me is one, especially if you're, to your point, someone who can tend to be a perfectionist, can tend to have some control factors, being willing to allow for that failure first without coming in and saving, to give direction and allow like maybe multiple rounds of partial failure, as opposed to that idea of like, okay, you failed, now see how I do it and how it's right, which is also not going to get you to new perspective or new ways of thinking on communications or marketing efforts.
Absolutely. It's another question, actually, is because you see some people that obviously work within a business for a long time, become very successful, and then you get those that kind of move around a bit more. And I guess if you've been in an organization a long time, you're obviously gifted with those skills of knowing the business very, very well. But I wonder if sometimes the change, and sort of cultural changes and digital changes and everything else are slightly harder to adapt to, because you've become more institutionalized by the business. And I guess those that kind of move around and probably don't feel like they're so great at one particular thing, because they're trying lots of different businesses, lots of different skill sets, but maybe feel that they're slightly more open to that kind of change, because they're having to adapt quite a lot. So it must be quite a challenge, actually, when you've got teams with very diverse skill sets, and maybe some that have sort of sat in a career for a long time, maybe some that have moved quite a lot, to kind of gel those experiences together, and try and get the best out of everyone, and try and get the mindsets in the same place as well when you're trying to evolve their skills.
That's true. I think the learning is a muscle. It's a muscle you have to use, and use it or lose it. And so even if you're in a particular role or type of role for a long time, I think my hope and my challenge to those team members would be, still find other ways to really step out of comfort zone, to really step into a learning mode, so that you can build the skills of how to learn and how to adapt, and the humility that comes with that, from remembering what it's like to take something on where you really are figuring it out on the go.
Absolutely. What gets you sort of really excited about being a leader today, in this current climate now?
That's a fun question. I think that some of this is also a cultural tendency that I'm finding the adaptation for. So one thing that's been a cultural adaptation is that Americans are quite informal, and our leadership can be quite informal, which is not always the case for my team members or for different leaders here. But there's something in that movement over time as well, that like leadership itself has become more fundamentally accessible and informal, that I find to surface really great stuff. So being in an environment where your team can give you as a leader constructive feedback, or can bring something, can take their own kind of versions of leadership within the team, you get something really kind of rich and dynamic there. I think that that's really exciting, and it gives everybody a chance to grow in new directions. And so I do really love to see folks grow and stretch and take different perspectives to the next thing they do, but also to sort of break down those barriers on the team, seniority, not just leader and team, but seniority across the team, and start from that idea that everyone can make everyone else's work better, and everyone can give feedback and ideas that are going to be valuable, regardless of level, regardless of expertise. I think that starts to, when that kind of gets everyone using different parts of their brain that are going to make all the work stronger and more agile.
Great. I know this question's been bandied around a bit today, but I do always find it a really interesting question, because you think about it a lot yourself, which is, what advice would you give yourself if you were kind of starting out in the industry?
Oh, I wouldn't have followed it. I would say, I mean, fundamentally relax, fundamentally let go of what you see as kind of barriers. So let go of the things outside your control. Let go of, oh, but this really isn't the structure we should be in to accomplish this. Let go of, oh, but this, the resources sit in the wrong places. Like fundamentally let go of all the things that you feel like are barriers. Don't let those be what you are wrestling with. Put that mental energy towards the things you can control, and so many of the other things will solve themselves along the way.
That
Or
resonates
they
with
won't,
me
and you'll
very
go
much.
somewhere else. Yeah, like have this sort of like fundamental, just like fundamentally let go of that worry because it's not serving you. And I think
Yeah.
that is a really difficult thing for us to allow ourselves to say, like, yeah, not lots of stuff suboptimal, don't know where it's gonna go. Focus, let me focus on my bites as I go and on what I can really drive impact on, and think a little differently about that. But that's really difficult. I don't think my younger self would have been able to do that, and it's still something that I'm pushing my current self on all the time. But it's something that would have made the last 15 years better for me personally. So better, like more mentally healthy, and brought me better well-being, as well as probably, I think, freed up more room
Yeah.
to do the parts of my job that I love.
You've really resonated with me there. I think it's so easy to get completely focused on things out of your control and waste a lot of time and energy on them. And even reminding yourself, even at the stage of the career you are now, to kind of let those go and just work on the things that can be improved. That's such a good piece of advice. And then another question I have really is around, what do you think in terms of in the workplaces as women, diversity, etc. What can we do as individuals? How can we be better individuals, do you think?
That's a really good question. I think that a lot of it comes from seeking out and actively promoting something that like runs counter to your own. So like I'm a very strong extrovert. I like to operate in real time. I've had to be really conscious to make room for introverts on the team to be able to go away and do their thinking and bring back, as opposed to always expecting everyone to operate how I operate, and to not think of the way I operate as inherently what I want people to move towards. Not giving feedback that's like, oh yes, be more like me, but rather create an environment that you can really be your best in either scenario. But I think that really extends outside kind of those classic like work mode operations, introvert, extrovert, what have you, and really goes into much different backgrounds, having come up in much different cultures, on how you're supposed to express yourself, or how you've been encouraged to express yourself in other environments. And so every time, and of course we're getting into like performance review season, every time I'm writing feedback or challenges, either as a 360 or for my own team, I try to really, everything I write, reread and think, would this actually take away something that this person has that's valuable? If I'm telling, or am I telling them to be more like me? Am I telling them to be more like a Nestle classic person? Am I trying to take away something that they bring that's unique and move them more to the mainstream, or am I giving them feedback that's actually going to strengthen what they already bring? And I think that that's something, when we talk about some of the ideas around like imposter syndrome and that sort of thing, I think a lot of it comes from us, even when we're trying to be a diverse and inclusive workplace, giving feedback that's like fundamental. Like, I've brought you in for a different perspective, and I know you're going to be really like bringing something of value, and also please change everything about yourself to better reflect your very generic peers. And so I think like taking that challenge to all of the feedback you give and all of the way you evaluate talent is a really important and difficult, like uncomfortable step.
It's really, really important actually. And I myself did some training where you realize they did color coded training, and you realize you're a certain type of color, but you perhaps weren't being generous or open-minded enough to accept other people's colors. And as in, we were coded red if you were a bit of an extrovert, or blue if you're an introvert. And some people like detail, but actually just, you know, really accepting people for working in a different way and having different, you know, approaches to projects is so important. And we talk about it a lot as an organization, but it's really down to us as individuals to be able to, you know, be like that ourselves, be very open-minded and adapt and change, and then obviously help the business to evolve. But that's really helpful and great to hear.
I'm hopeful we can get better at it. It really is a hard muscle to break.
Absolutely. And but it's your two last points are so important to sort of for all of us to remind ourselves, you know, the way we conduct ourselves in the business. I think we might be coming to the end of our time. So I just wanted to ask if you had any sort of last thoughts on the industry or anything that, you know, you wanted to share with us before we wrap up the session.
Yeah, I was in another conversation this week about like inside out purpose communications, like kind of opening the veil on your company or your brand and really showing from the inside out. And one of the questions was about what's your approach for internal activists and the employees or the team members who really push and challenge and don't think you're going far enough. And there is something really special about embracing that, both in ourselves and for our teams, about being willing to be someone who is annoying about the push for progress. So I think that's something I would leave with is where can we all go kind of a step farther in a push for progress, have a little bit more of a direct challenge to a status quo that needs to be challenged, and where can we actually like reward and make safe our teams to do that? Where can we say, you know, challenge me as a leader, call out the places that I'm not doing right by you, or that I'm not making an inclusive environment enough of a priority for us. So I think that was one that really stuck with me, because it often is, I've seen leaders get rattled by it because it's sort of a new cultural world where an employee feels comfortable telling the C-suite this isn't good enough. But it also is kind of an amazing effect. And I've seen leaders really transform and take much more decisive action based on that feedback. So that's something that excites me as a trend in talent and culture and kind of a broader cultural movement. And it's something that I think today we can kind of take away and take a little like fire in our bellies on, which is a very Americanism, but to get that extra oomph to bring a challenge to our leaders, to be willing to say that where we are right now from an inclusion perspective, whether it's racial equity, whether it's women in leadership, is not acceptable and is something we need to make much faster progress on, because I think leaders are affected by hearing that, and then we can see how that makes their movement faster, even if it's still not fast enough.
That's great. What a great way to end the session. It's very inspirational. So thank you so much for inspiring me and everyone else, I'm sure that's been listening. And it's really great to talk to you.